What you see behind me is the world's strictest and largest prison. This mega prison has a capacity of 40,000. Prisoners here are the most unsafe people you can even imagine.
El Salvador's CECOT is no prison. It's a fortress of despair, sprawling 7 football fields wide and built to cage 40,000 men. Since January 31st, 2020, more than 60,000 gang members have been thrown inside. Rights erased, lives stripped bare. To many, it is hell on earth. But what drove President Nayib Bukele to launch such a ruthless crackdown?
We're very eager to help. We know that you have a crime problem, a terrorism problem, that you need help.
And what truly happens within Latin America's largest prison? Join us as we expose how El Salvador crushed its brutal gangs. The world's murder capital.
An emergency has been imposed in the small Central American nation of El Salvador after the country recorded over 60 killings in the last 48 hours.
El Salvador is a nation where death has long been measured in hours. At its peak, this small Central American country recorded a homicide almost every single hour, earning the grim reputation of being the world's murder capital. In 2015, its homicide rate reached levels unseen anywhere else on Earth. That October alone, the scale of violence was staggering. Over 900 murders in just 1 month. Every day, close to 30 Salvadorans lost their lives.
It doesn't take long when you're, going out at night to stumble upon a scene like this with a body laying dead in the streets.
In a country of only 6.3 million people, smaller than New York City, such numbers meant entire communities lived under a shadow of constant fear. The brutality stemmed from the bloody war between two of the world's most feared gangs, MS-13 and Barrio 18. Their rivalry transformed neighborhoods into battlegrounds, leaving behind waves of grief and despair. But behind this endless cycle of violence lies a deeper history, one that stretches far beyond El Salvador's borders, back to the United States. In October 2015, the University of Washington's Center for Human Rights filed a lawsuit against the CIA, pressing for the release of classified files on war crimes in El Salvador.
Now, a U.S. university has sued the CIA to force it to release classified documents over war crimes committed in El Salvador.
The connection is not distant. Salvadorans represent one of the largest groups of undocumented immigrants deported from the U.S. Their displacement traces back to the country's brutal civil war, which raged from 1979 to 1992. During that war, the U.S. funded and trained Salvadoran civilians, many of whom became notorious death squad members. Washington knew these groups carried out assassinations, yet the support continued. In February 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero, El Salvador's most powerful moral voice, wrote directly to President Jimmy Carter. He pleaded for America to stop arming those who were terrorizing his people. 3 weeks later, Romero was gunned down while saying, "Mass."
He was assassinated by a right-wing death squad, and that his sermon was in some ways the final straw.
His funeral on March 31st, 1980, drew 250,000 mourners to the capital. What began as an act of collective grief turned into carnage when government forces opened fire. 42 people lost their lives, and hundreds were wounded. The message was clear: even the dead were not safe. The same year brought more horror. On December 2nd, 1980, 4 American missionary women were kidnapped by 5 Salvadoran guards.
We knew that they were missing, and so really that night, it was just waiting.
They were tortured, assaulted, and their lives were prematurely taken. Their bodies were discovered the next morning. International outrage was immediate, and President Carter briefly cut aid to the Salvadoran regime. But the cycle of violence had already forged resistance. Citizens formed the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, the FMLN, a paramilitary force determined to fight the Salvadoran military on its terms. For a moment, it seemed they might reclaim their nation. Then came Ronald Reagan. With his election, U.S. support for El Salvador's government intensified. $10 million in new aid flowed in, half of it for weapons, helicopters, and ammunition. International critics warned that this was fueling the conflict, but the money and guns kept arriving. The Salvadoran military also received training from Chile's dictatorship, while Argentina's brutal junta joined in under the covert program known as Operation Charlie. Together, they sharpened El Salvador's war machine, ensuring the bloodshed would last for years. By 1989, the Salvadoran Civil War had reached a brutal stalemate. The FMLN launched fierce attacks on the armed forces, showing they could not be defeated, but neither side could claim victory. For a decade, the conflict had dragged on, and now the world around it was beginning to change. The collapse of the Soviet Union cut off vital support for the FMLN. At the same time, the Cold War ended, leaving Washington with little reason to continue propping up El Salvador's counterinsurgency. But the real turning point came in November 1989. 6 Jesuit priests, including Ignacio Ellacuria, the rector of the country's leading university, were assassinated inside their residence, along with their housekeeper, Elba Ramos, and her teenage daughter, Selena. The culprits were Salvadoran soldiers. The crime against these respected priests shocked the world. It forced the Salvadoran government to pretend outrage, as if the truth of its brutality had only just been discovered. The United States, embarrassed by its role in funding and training such forces, began pressing for peace. By the time peace talks finally began, El Salvador was already shattered. More than 80,000 lives had been lost, and nearly every family carried scars of the war. Tens of thousands fled to the United States, most settling in Los Angeles and across California. But the violence they escaped did not disappear. It traveled with them, and soon the streets of their new home would be turned upside down. The birth of Mara Salvatrucha. In Los Angeles, Salvadoran refugee children carried the scars of a war they barely understood. They arrived in America only to face poverty, broken homes, and hostile streets. Most were teenagers, and survival meant strength in numbers. Surrounded by other ethnic groups, they formed their circle of protection and identity. That circle soon became a gang, Mara Salvatrucha, better known as MS-13. Conflict followed quickly. Mara Salvatrucha clashed with Chinese and black communities, defending its neighborhoods with ruthless pride. Their motto was sharp and straightforward: Vivo por mi madre, muero por mi barrio, meaning, I live for my mother, I die for my neighborhood. It was more than a slogan, it was a declaration of loyalty and a warning to outsiders who dared to steal, intrude, or harm. As violence spiraled across Los Angeles, the U.S. government responded with deportations.
Our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Beginning in 1989, young Salvadorans tied to gangs or criminal records were sent back to their homeland. For thousands, deportation became a life sentence. Roughly 4,000 gang members were returned to a country that had just emerged from a decade-long civil war. El Salvador was in no shape to handle them. Society was broken. Families fractured, the economy collapsed, and thousands of children were left orphans. The nation lacked both resources and infrastructure to absorb the influx. Suddenly, young men hardened in the streets of Los Angeles were dropped into a fragile country still choking on poverty and instability. There were no jobs, no programs, no safety net. With nothing to lose, gangs grew into something far more dangerous than street cliques. They became organized machines of violence. Extortion, intimidation, and bloodshed replaced opportunity. The state's response was just as fragile. A new national police force, built from former soldiers and guerrillas, was untrained, unprepared, and overwhelmed. Reintegration programs didn't exist. Psychological services were unheard of. Instead, young men were left to fend for themselves in a nation where violence had already become routine. Neglect bred crime, and for countless Salvadoran youth, joining a gang wasn't a choice, it was survival. From those streets rose MS-13 and Barrio 18, groups that would grow into global symbols of terror, with power reaching far beyond El Salvador's borders. The new national order. Mara Salvatrucha's name is a mix of meanings: Mara for gang, Salva for El Salvador, and Trucha for streetwise. The 13 represents the letter M, the gang's symbolic link to the Mexican mafia. MS-13 thrives on recruiting young men from poor neighborhoods. Their initiation is brutal, a 13-second beating followed by a violent act, often murder. Once inside, there's no escape. Leaving is almost always a death sentence. Their loyalty is written across their bodies, with tattoos covering their chests, arms, and faces. By 2008, the FBI estimated MS-13 had up to 10,000 members in the United States alone, making it one of the country's most dangerous gangs. Barrio 18, their bitter rival, is no less ruthless. Born in Los Angeles as a breakaway from the Clanton 14 gang, its ranks were primarily filled with Mexican immigrants. They claimed territory in neighborhoods like MacArthur Park in LA's Koreatown, enforcing strict rules with violent punishments. Defiance meant an 18-second beating or, in severe cases, execution. Members displayed tattoos, wore blue and black, and carried the number 18 as a badge of allegiance. Both gangs eventually spread across El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, feeding off weak governments and deep social divides. Barrio 18 strangled El Salvador's public transport system through extortion, while MS-13 built vast networks dealing in drugs, weapons, kidnapping, and murder. By 2016, they had carved the country into territories, controlling 247 out of 262 municipalities. Moving across zones required extortion payments, and businesses were forced to hand over protection money. Silence was enforced through fear. Witnesses risked torture, rape, or death, often extended to their families. The result was staggering. In 2009, El Salvador became the most violent nation on earth with 71 homicides per 100,000 people. Honduras later overtook it, but by 2015, El Salvador reclaimed the title with 103 homicides per 100,000, the highest rate recorded anywhere in the past century.
The man has made an incredible number of enemies, even if most are now exiled or imprisoned, and he's positioned himself.
Gang numbers exploded. In 2004, there were an estimated 39,000 members in El Salvador. By 2012, that figure had nearly tripled. Together, they pulled in more than $31 million a year, mainly through extortion and drug trafficking. Their influence stretched beyond Central America into the United States, Europe, and even Africa. S-13's reputation was cemented by horrific crimes abroad. In New York, 2 teenage girls lost their lives in a brutal act of revenge. In Houston, members were arrested for kidnapping, assault, and executing 3 young women. These stories shocked the world, but they were only a glimpse of the wider horror El Salvador was living every day. By then, the country was on the brink of collapse, strangled by gangs and corruption. Then came Nayib Bukele, a leader whose brutal crackdown would defy decades of failure and force the nation onto a new path. For the first time in years, the future no longer pointed to inevitable self-destruction. But Bukele did not start from zero. To understand how he got there and how he broke the gang's grip, we need to rewind. Fighting El Salvador's cancer. Antonio Saka and other former Salvadoran presidents' initiatives laid the foundation for Nayib Bukele's plan to halt gang violence. In June 2004, President Saka introduced the Supermano Dura policy, granting the military the authority to patrol gang-controlled areas, conduct random searches, and arrest individuals based on appearance alone.
All these guys were once prideful and running the streets of El Salvador. Now they are locked behind bars.
This strategy led to about 4,000 arrests and severe prison overcrowding. By 2012, gangs were powerful enough to negotiate truces with the government. In March of that year, MS-13 and Barrio 18 reached a ceasefire with the Salvadoran state. Though controversial and criticized as ceding sovereignty to criminal groups, the truce brought undeniable results. In early 2012, El Salvador lost an average of 16 lives a day. By late March, the number fell to fewer than 5. On April 14th, for the first time in over 3 years, not a single gang-related death was recorded. Fatal crimes dropped from 411 in January to just 188 in March, a near 50% reduction. Yet, like every truce before it, the peace unraveled. Violence returned to the streets, deadlier than ever. By 2015, there were an estimated 60,000 gang members in El Salvador. Roughly 70% of businesses were being extorted, costing the economy an estimated $4 billion annually. The homicide rate soared to levels even higher than during the Civil War, making the country one of the most dangerous places on earth.
But for any political leader across the globe, Bukele included, actions speak louder than words.
So if past leaders tried and failed, and truces collapsed into bloodshed, how did Bukele finally succeed in breaking the gang's stranglehold? The man with an iron fist. Nayib Bukele was born in the middle of the Salvadoran Civil War and raised in San Salvador by his Palestinian father. This businessman brought the first McDonald's franchise to the country. His father also owned a textile company, helped build 4 mosques, and ran a public relations firm. Nayib Bukele grew up in a large family with 3 brothers and 7 half-siblings, attending a bilingual private school in the capital. Bukele's political path was unconventional. After leaving college, he managed a nightclub in downtown San Salvador. Later, he took charge of the family's PR agency, whose biggest client was the FMLN, the former guerrilla movement that had fought the army during the war. At the time, El Salvador was dominated by the conservative Arena Party, founded in the 1980s by a leader tied to right-wing death squads. Arena held power for decades, backed by business elites, former soldiers, and religious conservatives. But in 2009, corruption scandals brought the party down, allowing the FMLN to rise and take control of the government.
that are poisoning the minds of our Salvadorian youth are gonna be the first to bleed.
With his ties to the FMLN, Bukele launched a campaign for mayor of Nuevo Cuscatlán, a small municipality outside the capital. He won, and his success opened the door to greater ambitions. The FMLN backed him for mayor of San Salvador, where he gained national attention. But the FMLN's reputation had become toxic, weighed down by corruption and broken promises. To survive politically, Bukele broke away and built his party, the vehicle that carried him to the presidency. On June 1, 2019, Nayib Bukele was sworn in as El Salvador's 43rd president. At just 37 years old, he became Latin America's youngest head of state, promising a fresh start for a country exhausted by gangs and corruption. His first attempts to address gang violence reportedly involved negotiations, as revealed by the investigative outlet El Faro. But within days of that report, Bukele announced a money laundering probe into the paper. From then on, he repeatedly attacked El Faro, sometimes naming individual journalists. Some fled the country, others left temporarily after publishing critical stories.
Influence operations alongside US aid, while internationally, he started to throw his weight around more actively in regional affairs.
Despite strong international backing, El Faro's image inside El Salvador began to suffer, with many citizens now seeing it as biased or unreliable. Soon after, the National Assembly passed a law banning journalists from publishing or sharing gang-related information that could spread fear. Breaking this law could mean up to 10 years in prison. For Bukele, this was part of a larger strategy: silence the gang's voice in the media while waging war on their power in the streets. That war came suddenly. In March 2022, MS-13 unleashed a 3-day bloodbath that shocked the nation. None had gang ties. It was a brutal message aimed directly at Bukele, who had vowed to crush gang violence and promote Surf City, his new tourist hub.
MS-13 and many other gangs. These are animals. These aren't people.
Bodies were left along the roads as a warning. The massacre pushed Bukele into action. He declared a state of emergency and launched a sweeping crackdown that would transform El Salvador's future and ignite one of the most controversial debates in modern Latin American history: the brutal hunt. Bukele's approach to gangs broke every familiar rule. He ordered rival members to be locked together, shoulder to shoulder, in prisons that once kept them apart. Soon after, chilling images emerged: men stripped to the waist, shaved heads bowed, crammed into tight rows under armed watch. The message was clear: fear would now be a weapon. Behind this display came a harsher reality. Bukele pushed through laws that tore away basic protections. Citizens could be detained without warrants, watched through state surveillance, and cut off from lawyers. Even the right to move freely was suspended. Suddenly, the government had the power to decide who walked free and who vanished into custody. Arrests followed at lightning speed.
In his 7th year at the head of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele has managed literally the coup of a lifetime.
Within months, more than 33,000 people had been swept up. Gang members, alleged associates, and, critics warned, even innocents caught on suspicion alone. Under the state of emergency, detainees no longer had to see a judge within 72 hours. Families and lawyers often had no idea where their relatives had been taken. New laws made prison a near-permanent fate. Sentences grew longer, house arrest was abolished, and those tied to gangs had virtually no way out. But the harshest symbol of this crackdown stood in Tecoluca, the Center for the Confinement of Terrorism, CECOT, a vast concrete fortress built to cage the country's most feared gang leaders. With space for 40,000 inmates, its size rivals global landmarks. Once inside, escape is not an option. Footage from CECOT reveals an unsettling world. Prisoners herded off buses, hands bound, heads shaved. Inside, masked guards direct them into overcrowded cells. Surveillance never ends, and the air feels thick with tension, an unspoken reminder of the violence that shaped them and the power now crushing them. CECOT is more than a prison. It is a stage for the state's new order, where intimidation, control, and dehumanization merge into one chilling spectacle. Inside the mega-prison, there are no family visits, no rehabilitation programs, and no classes to prepare inmates for life outside. On rare occasions, a handful of carefully chosen prisoners are allowed to give short motivational talks, either through cell corridors or during exercise breaks, always under the watchful eye of armed guards. Spend every hour locked indoors. Each cell crams in 65 to 70 men, while steel catwalks above let guards watch their every move from overhead. The prison itself is not without amenities. There are dining halls, recreation rooms, a gym, and even board games, but they are for the guards alone. The inmates live in conditions far different. Though cells were built for 100 men, they contain only 2 sinks and 2 toilets. And as the prison pushes toward its 40,000 inmate limit, the situation only grows worse. The entire compound is sealed off and guarded by military police. The details you just heard are the ones Bukele's government shares with the world. But many journalists believe the actual reality inside is far darker than the official story. Still, one question rises above everything else. Has Bukele's hardline strategy worked, or is the cost greater than the country dares to admit? El Salvador's complete turnover. Under President Bukele, El Salvador now holds the highest incarceration rate in the world. Nearly 2% of the adult population is behind bars, according to the International Crisis Group. The effects of his crackdown are visible everywhere. The once feared MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs have vanished from neighborhoods they controlled for decades. In the past, residents needed gang approval just to cross into specific areas. Even basic tasks like commuting to work or visiting a hospital often required permission. Gangs dictated who could sell goods, where they could sell them, and how much they owed for the privilege. That grip has been broken.
Thanks to a video of the massacre taken by a gang member.
Today, people say they feel safer. Communities once ruled by violence are taking back parks and public spaces. Local projects that were impossible under gang control are finally moving forward. In towns like San Miguel and parts of San Salvador, even small things like community soccer tournaments have returned. For many, these games symbolize freedom that was unthinkable only a few years ago. Some residents claim they've seen gang members return, but their presence carries far less weight. The control they once held is no longer the same. Extortion was the gang's lifeline. Before the state of emergency, they drained money from street vendors, taxi drivers, shopkeepers, and bus companies. Payments were based on perceived wealth. A vendor might hand over a few dollars a day, while a transport owner could lose thousands each month. Refusing to pay often meant brutal punishment or death. That has changed. Residents in former strongholds told Insight Crime they no longer receive threats or demands for money. Bus operators in San Salvador reported that gangs stopped collecting fees almost immediately after the crackdown began. One owner, who had paid nearly $6,000 each month to MS-13 and Barrio 18, said those payments ended overnight. The impact has been devastating for the gangs. El Salvador's police recorded a 54% drop in extortion complaints between January and September 11th, compared to the same period in 2022. By that date, only 572 reports had been filed, with just under 300 naming MS-13 or Barrio 18. This collapse of extortion networks shows how deeply the state of emergency cut into gang power. With thousands of members arrested and many others hiding, the organizations have struggled to maintain control over the streets. But the question remains, if Bukele's approach is working so effectively, why hasn't the rest of Central America followed his lead? And more importantly, what is the actual cost of this strategy for the Salvadoran people? The price for freedom. Bukele's hardline approach has set the world talking. For some, it is proof of courage and vision. For others, it is evidence of human rights violations and an assault on democracy itself. Yet the numbers are hard to ignore. In 2023, El Salvador recorded a homicide rate of just 8 per 100,000 people, lower than the United States and the lowest in the country's history. The effect rippled across Latin America. In Guatemala and Honduras, crowds rallied in his name.
Bordering Honduras and Guatemala is often referred to as one of the most dangerous in the world.
In Costa Rica, Security Minister Jorge Torres openly suggested his country should borrow from Bukele's playbook. Even Rodolfo Hernandez, a presidential candidate in Colombia, traveled to San Salvador to see Bukele's methods up close. In Chile, where crime continues to climb, pro-Bukele demonstrations spread quickly on social media, capturing public imagination. His critics remain the minority. When Ecuador's president, Guillermo Lasso, warned Bukele might be going too far, his words were quickly brushed aside. Polls revealed something striking. Bukele was more admired in Ecuador than many of Ecuador's leaders. But admiration is one thing, repetition is another. Copying Bukele's model has never been straightforward. For decades, Latin America has experimented with different strategies to break organized crime.
Ingrid already has a hypothesis on this crime.
And most have ended in chaos. Colombia's battle with the Medellin cartel in the 1980s and early 1990s unleashed bombings, assassinations, and fear at every level of society. Mexico tried its version under President Felipe Calderón, who launched a military offensive against cartels in 2006. Instead of peace, the country saw a bloodbath as rival groups fought for dominance and murder rates soared. Other governments tried the opposite route: negotiation. Colombia struck a deal with Pablo Escobar, agreeing to end the bombings if he surrendered. In return, Escobar served time in a prison of his design, complete with soccer fields, luxury comforts, and guards who answered only to him. The compromise lowered killings for a short time, but at a humiliating cost to the state's authority. Mexico once relied on a softer balance, too. For 70 years under the Institutional Revolutionary Party, cartel violence was kept in check through tight government control, with agencies like the Federal Security Directorate managing criminal networks rather than confronting them head-on.
The most powerful is the Sinaloa cartel, almost the 70% of the world.
Since the 2000s, Brazil has provided another telling example. In São Paulo, an informal pact between law enforcement and the powerful First Capital Command gang has helped transform one of South America's most violent cities into one of its safest. In each case, the story is the same. When one or two groups consolidate control, negotiations become possible, and intercartel violence is contained. But El Salvador's approach is far more costly. International lenders warn that by 2027, the nation's public debt could reach a staggering 97.5% of GDP, mainly driven by billions poured into police salaries, military expansion, and constant patrols. Then comes geography. Unlike El Salvador, larger nations such as Guatemala and Honduras have sprawling, diverse territories and active civil societies likely to resist such heavy-handed tactics. In Costa Rica, Panama, and even the Dominican Republic, strong institutions could act as guardrails, limiting any attempt to copy Bukele's crackdown. And there is the human factor. Gang members are not faceless figures. They have families. Mass arrests without fair trials fuel anger, pushback, and resentment. Even Bukele's numbers tell a complicated story. While his government boasts of detaining over 70,000 gang affiliates, police records reveal only about 32,000 were actual members. The rest? Suspects, alleged collaborators, or simply under investigation. That leaves more than 42,000 gang operatives still free, a sobering reminder that the war is far from over. Complicating matters further are allegations that Bukele has deeper ties to shadow networks. He faces accusations of laundering money for Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro, with one of his key backers, businessman Juan Luis Marin, previously linked to arms trafficking for Colombia's FARC rebels. So can Bukele's model work elsewhere? Perhaps. But exporting it could unleash chaos instead of control. More cartels may rise, more firepower could flood the streets, and civil society spaces might shrink. Overcrowded prisons may become breeding grounds for even stronger criminal syndicates. Bukele has won a second term, and with it, the mandate to intensify his campaign. For some, this promises continued safety on the streets. For others, it raises a darker question of how much democracy and freedom must be sacrificed in the name of security. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.